I arrived at work before anyone else, as I always did. The morning light was pale against the windows, cutting through the faint haze of steam from the coffee machine. I liked the quiet before the restaurant filled with noise. No one noticed me here, not really. I moved between tables and trays like a shadow, careful, small, silent. It wasn't about hiding, it was about existing without drawing attention. My coworkers called me timid, shy, sometimes invisible. I accepted it because there was comfort in predictability. Their laughter, their gossip, it never reached me fully. I trusted that the world moved on without needing to notice me. I liked things orderly, the polished counters, the precise arrangement of cutlery, the hum of the refrigerator. Each day was a series of small certainties. I could rely on them, and that made life bearable. Lunch rush was my rhythm. Plates clattered, knives scratched against porcelain, the air smelled of bread and sautéed onions. I smiled politely, took orders, and carried them with care. Some customers were kind, most were not. I learned early that words were often a liability, that silence could be armor. I had my routines at home too. My apartment was small, sparse, orderly. The quiet was deliberate. I liked the way a book smelled, the way the kettle hissed when water boiled, the way the radiator hummed at night. Alone, I could breathe. Alone, I could trust myself completely. Trust wasn't reckless, it was calculated. I trusted my few friends, carefully chosen, quietly loyal. I trusted the manager to at least pretend fairness. I trusted the city to hum along its indifferent way. And I trusted that nothing, not anyone, would disturb the fragile balance of my life until that day. The first time I saw her, I didn't understand what had shifted. She wasn't loud, dramatic, or threatening. She was deliberate, careful, and completely unnoticed by everyone else except me. She moved through the restaurant with a weightless authority, holding her child's hand, her gaze calm, observing. There was no announcement of her arrival. And yet the air seemed to change around her, the laughter of my coworkers faltering as if the walls themselves recognized her presence. I continued my work, pretending not to notice, but I did. I watched the way she scanned the room, how she acknowledged nothing and no one but her child. There was a quiet power in her, a subtle gravity. For the first time, I felt the fragility of my assumptions. People I had always trusted, managers, coworkers, regulars, were suddenly cast in a different light. And I sensed that nothing here would remain invisible for long, not if she was watching. I finished wiping down a table, my hands trembling slightly without my permission. The restaurant's rhythm continued, but a new tension had settled, almost imperceptibly, like the first hint of winter on a warm morning. The world I trusted, the small, orderly life I relied on, was no longer certain. And yet I couldn't have named why. Silence, I realized, had its own weight. The days after her arrival were quiet, but not the kind of quiet I had once known. There were subtle changes in the air, small details that made my chest tight in ways I couldn't yet name. It began with the glances, quick, half-hidden, exchanged between coworkers when they thought I wasn't looking. At first, I dismissed them as coincidence, idle chatter, nothing meaningful. But my instincts, honed by years of observation and silence, whispered otherwise. A tray would slip from my grasp by a hair's width, though I had placed it carefully. A colleague would accidentally misplace an order, leaving me to take responsibility. These were minor inconveniences, easily overlooked. I told myself I was imagining patterns, that I was reading too much into normal clumsiness. Yet the frequency made me uneasy. Then came the whispers. I caught fragments at the edge of my hearing, snippets of laughter, a tone I didn't recognize in familiar voices. "She's so timid," someone said, and I forced a polite smile, pretending not to hear, but the words sank deeper than I admitted to myself. I trusted people, yet trust now felt like a fragile layer stretched thin over unseen tensions. Even the regular customers seemed different. A smile from a familiar face felt hollow. A compliment lingered too long, coated with something I could not place. The subtle unease gnawed at me during quiet moments, but it was always easy enough to dismiss. After all, life was rarely perfectly smooth, and I had learned to accept discomfort as part of the background hum. At home, I noticed things too. Small changes, almost imperceptible. A missing pen, the faint echo of someone else's presence outside my door. I shook my head, telling myself it was coincidence, paranoia, exhaustion. But a shadow of doubt had planted itself, and it grew quietly in the corners of my mind. Sleep came less easily, my thoughts wandering into spaces I preferred not to enter. The mother and child appeared again that week, sitting quietly in the corner of the restaurant, calm as ever. I watched them, instinctively protective, though I had no reason. There was a gravity to her presence that made others falter. Her eyes scanned without accusation, yet I could feel their weight on those who underestimated her. Even in the background, she seemed to unsettle the room in a way that unsettled me too. One evening, a coworker left a note in my locker, just a short line: "Watch carefully. Things aren't as they seem." My hands shook as I held it, reading and rereading, trying to understand if it was a joke or a warning. There was no signature. I wanted to ignore it, to dismiss it, but I couldn't. The words lingered, echoing against the rhythm of my routine, a subtle tremor beneath the surface of normalcy. I realized then that something was shifting. The layers of trust I had built, carefully, cautiously, were beginning to fray. The world that felt safe, predictable, and orderly had started to hint at something darker. And yet, I convinced myself it was nothing. It started with small inconsistencies, almost imperceptible if I hadn't been paying attention. Orders that were supposed to be delivered one way came back altered. A coworker swore they had spoken to a customer, but the record showed no interaction. Names were mispronounced, schedules changed without notice, and minor mistakes were quietly blamed on me. At first, I accepted these as oversights, simple human error, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. I began keeping notes, subtle observations recorded in the margins of a notebook no one else noticed. A tip jar that balanced perfectly one morning would be inexplicably short by evening. A regular customer would swear they had spoken to someone, yet the timestamp contradicted their story. Each discrepancy alone was insignificant. Together, they suggested something more deliberate. The whispers had grown sharper, edged with malice I could no longer ignore. Glances followed me longer, eyes narrowing when I passed. Conversations hushed at my approach. I felt the shift in the room's energy, a quiet tension that settled over tables like dust. My coworkers' laughter no longer felt harmless. It carried a pointedness I could not dismiss. Then there were the moments of overt deception. One colleague swore they had updated a reservation, yet the host computer showed it untouched. A manager asked me to verify a delivery I had already confirmed. When I presented evidence, they laughed, dismissing me as overthinking, as if my careful attention were a flaw. The lies were small but deliberate, and their purpose felt increasingly clear. I found myself questioning everything I had trusted: schedules, orders, the casual assurances of those around me. The quiet routine I had depended on now seemed precarious. I began noticing patterns I had once ignored: the way certain coworkers paired off in conversation, the way their eyes flicked toward me when I spoke, the subtle avoidance in their gestures. At home, I replayed the day in my mind, seeking rational explanations. Fatigue, perhaps, or my own hypersensitivity. Yet even in my attempts to rationalize, a cold certainty took root. Something was being hidden from me. Trust, once effortless, had become fragile, subject to invisible currents beyond my control. The mother and child were there again one evening. She said nothing, watched silently, her eyes sweeping the room with an ease I envied. I noticed the same coworkers who whispered and misled me faltering in her presence. She didn't confront them, didn't accuse, didn't need to. Her calm observation was a mirror I couldn't ignore. Something about her presence confirmed what my instincts had begun to recognize. Not everyone was who they appeared to be, and some people's intentions were not just careless, they were deliberate. I realized the first red flags weren't dramatic or violent. They were subtle, woven into everyday interactions, unnoticed by anyone who didn't pay attention. And yet the message was clear. The world I had relied on, the careful order of my life, was no longer entirely mine. There were forces in motion, quiet but deliberate, and they had noticed me. I felt the first real weight of suspicion settle in my chest, heavy and unyielding. I couldn't yet name the threat, but I knew it existed. By now, I had begun to voice my concerns, cautiously, in moments when it seemed safe. A misplaced order, a forgotten message, a whisper of something unspoken. I asked, I clarified, I sought acknowledgement. But each time the response was the same: subtle derision, casual dismissal, sometimes outright mockery. "You're imagining things," one coworker said, smiling as if to reassure me, but their eyes didn't match the words. The smile was a shield, not kindness. I questioned myself. Perhaps I was too sensitive, too quiet, too observant. Perhaps I had read meaning into mistakes that were meaningless. My instincts, once trusted implicitly, now clashed with the insistence of everyone around me that I was overreacting. At first, I faltered, doubted, and apologized for the very attentiveness that had protected me for so long. Then came the more deliberate moments. A manager denied requests I had clearly made. A coworker contradicted me openly in front of customers, their version presented with casual certainty. When I confronted them privately, they laughed it off. That didn't happen, or you just didn't hear me. My memory, my perception, my very reality began to feel fragile. The whispers followed me everywhere. Notes left unsigned, remarks overheard but denied, subtle sabotage framed as mistakes. Each instance chipped away at the foundation of trust I had built. I began to walk carefully, speaking less, observing more. Every interaction became a test. Would my words hold up? Would I be questioned, mocked, or ignored? At home, I tried to separate work from life, but the shadows followed. I replayed conversations, analyzed tones, questioned my own recollection. Sleep was restless. My thoughts raced in the dark, weighing the discrepancy between what I saw and what I was told. I felt isolated, as if my perception had become a liability rather than a strength. The mother and child appeared again during a busy shift. I watched her closely, seeking reassurance in her quiet presence. She said nothing, made no effort to intervene. Yet the way the staff straightened when she looked in their direction, the fleeting hesitation in their movements, told me she saw the truth even when no one else would admit it. Her silence was not ignorance, it was recognition. I began to understand the mechanics of the gaslighting. It was subtle, efficient, almost invisible. Mistakes that weren't mine became mine. Words I hadn't said were attributed to me. Evidence was denied, distorted, or withheld. And always, there was the insistence that I was mistaken, that my mind was unreliable, that my concerns were trivial. The strategy was clear. Wear me down, make me doubt, isolate me until the truth felt like a dream. I hated the effect it had on me. The careful equilibrium of my life, the trust in my own perception, was under siege. I felt cornered in silence, unable to speak without fear of derision, unable to act without invitation to doubt myself. And yet, beneath the fatigue, beneath the self-doubt, a spark remained. I had noticed the inconsistencies, the patterns, the deliberate manipulations. I could not yet confront them, but I understood them. And that understanding, though quiet, was my first weapon. The world told me I was wrong, but I knew in the core of myself that I was not. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A misplaced receipt on the counter, a copied note left carelessly in a drawer, small fragments of truth surfacing among layers of deception. I had begun to notice them, pieces that didn't belong, evidence I hadn't expected to find. Each one was a quiet confirmation of what I had feared all along. The betrayal wasn't imagined. A colleague, someone I had never fully trusted but had tolerated out of habit, hesitated one afternoon when I asked a simple question about an order. Their eyes flicked to the floor, and in that split second I saw it, an acknowledgement too brief to be noticed by anyone else, but enough for me. I knew then that someone else had been watching, someone had seen what I had not. I found the first document by accident, a misfiled record of reservations, showing entries that contradicted what the staff had told customers and managers alike. My hands shook as I traced the lines, recognizing patterns that could not be coincidences. Small lies, subtle manipulations, deliberate misdirection, they were all recorded here, quietly, waiting for me to see. The whispers in the staff room continued, but now they carried weight. I heard fragments of conversations I had never been meant to hear, words that confirmed suspicions I had barely dared to voice. A manager instructed someone in a tone meant to be discreet, yet the intent was unmistakable. Cover tracks, maintain appearances, avoid detection. I understood it all without them speaking to me directly. The mother and child were there again, sitting in their usual corner. She didn't intervene, didn't confront, but I noticed her gaze linger on the staff, calm yet piercing. She didn't need to speak. The subtle shift in the room spoke volumes. Even the most confident voices faltered when she looked their way. It was the first time I realized that recognition of the truth could exist without confrontation, that acknowledgement alone could destabilize those who depended on deception. Later, I encountered a witness, another employee, someone who had always been distant, who now approached me quietly. Their words were careful, measured. "I've seen what's happening. I don't know how to fix it, but it's real." No accusation, no dramatics, only confirmation. The betrayal I had felt instinctively was no longer abstract. It had form and it had names. The weight of this partial exposure was heavier than I anticipated. Confirmation was a strange relief, but it carried its own burden. The betrayal was real. The gaslighting had been deliberate. And now, I held proof that could no longer be dismissed as imagination. Even with the fragments in front of me, I understood that the full picture remained hidden. The most dangerous elements, the motivations, the ultimate scope of the betrayal, were still out of sight, obscured by careful planning. But knowing that part of the truth had surfaced changed everything. I returned to my station, moving through the rhythm of the restaurant, carrying the evidence silently in my mind. The world I had once trusted was no longer stable, and yet I could finally see it for what it was. Something was about to break. Once the partial exposure settled in my mind, the tension began to rise like a tide I could no longer hold back. The betrayer sensed that I had noticed, that I understood. Subtle manipulations became bolder. Tasks I had performed perfectly before were suddenly questioned, criticized in front of customers. Minor errors were amplified, replayed, dissected, framed as evidence of incompetence. Each interaction carried an unspoken warning: your understanding will not protect you. Colleagues who had once avoided me now watched closely, their expressions carefully neutral, yet betraying a faint unease. I could feel their calculation in every glance, every movement. Someone had noticed that the veil had slipped that I had begun to see. The quiet order of the restaurant, the rhythm I had relied on for comfort, was collapsing under the weight of deliberate scrutiny. One evening, I overheard a conversation in a back room, meant to be private. Voices hushed, but my presence had been sensed. They spoke of schedules, manipulations, and the need to keep her in line. I listened, silent, invisible, and confirmed what I had long suspected. The betrayal was not random, it was orchestrated. The people I had counted on, the systems I trusted, were aligned against me, yet the true force behind it remained unseen. The mother and child appeared again, her gaze sweeping the room with the same calm authority. I noticed something shift in the staff when she looked at them: hesitation, tension, the first signs of cracks in their confidence. Her presence seemed to challenge the carefully constructed narrative they had maintained. Without a word, she unsettled them, quietly exposing weaknesses that had been invisible until now. The stakes grew higher when small errors led to real consequences. Orders were delayed, customer complaints rose, and the management's patience thinned. I realized the betrayer had calculated this, that they were creating a controlled escalation to discredit me, to prove I was the source of problems. But it was a double-edged strategy. The closer they drew their web, the more visible their intent became to anyone willing to observe. I began to keep meticulous notes, documenting every interaction, every contradiction, every deliberate misstep. Each entry was evidence, a record of patterns that could no longer be denied. It was exhausting, isolating, and yet necessary. The cost of seeing the truth was fatigue and fear, but the alternative, remaining blind, was worse. I understood the dynamic now. This was not chaos, it was a carefully managed system of control, with the betrayer at its center and everyone else playing a role. The quiet power that had been hidden, the subtle manipulations, were now amplified, and I, the observer, was the target. By the end of that week, the air in the restaurant was tense, heavy, almost tangible. Every glance, every word carried weight. The partial exposure had shifted the balance, but it had also provoked escalation. The betrayer was confident, relentless, and the systems that supported them were mobilized in ways I could not yet fully counter. I realized, in that moment of quiet observation, that the next move would be decisive. The stakes were no longer small, and I had no choice but to meet them. The weight of it all became unbearable one afternoon, quietly, without warning. I was stacking plates, my hands shaking slightly as the rhythm of the restaurant continued around me. Orders blurred together, voices became a background hum, and yet every word cut sharper than it should have. I had been observing, documenting, calculating, and now the truth I had sought so carefully pressed down like a physical force. I felt the betrayal in full, raw, and unfiltered. Every lie, every omission, every deliberate manipulation crystallized in my mind. The coworkers who had dismissed me, mocked me, or actively misled me, every one of them now existed in sharp relief. I realized I had been underestimated for years, and that underestimation had been weaponized. The quiet cruelty of it was almost unbearable because it wasn't loud or explosive. It was methodical, invisible to anyone except the one who saw. At home, I couldn't escape it. I replayed conversations, reread notes, traced every subtle sign I had observed. My solitude offered no comfort. The silence that had once been armor now felt like a cage. I cried quietly, ashamed that my trust had been so thoroughly exploited, angry that my perception had been challenged and minimized for so long. And yet, I could not regret noticing. The truth was heavy, but it was mine, and that clarity mattered, even in its cost. The mother and child appeared again at the restaurant, as if sensing my turmoil. She didn't speak to me or anyone else, yet I felt her awareness. There was no judgment in her gaze, only observation. And in that observation, I recognized a strange kinship. She had survived under scrutiny and misunderstanding, navigating worlds that underestimated her. I drew a small, quiet strength from that presence, even as I acknowledged the fragility of my own. I understood the emotional cost now. To see clearly is to bear witness to pain, and the more I saw, the heavier it became. The betrayal was complete, not just in its acts, but in the quiet orchestration, the calculated dismissal of my perception, the systemic support for deception. The realization left me hollow, exhausted, and painfully aware that I could not undo what had been done. And yet, there was also resolve, subtle and unspoken. I did not need to confront anyone yet, did not need to demand recognition. I simply held the truth, and in holding it, I claimed a form of power they could not touch. It was quiet. It was restrained. It was heavy. By the end of that day, I had accepted the full scope of the betrayal. I carried it like a physical weight, pressing against my chest with each breath. The world had not changed, but I had. I understood now, in a way I could not unlearn, the cost of trust, the depth of deception, and the quiet devastation of being underestimated. The breaking point was not a scream or a confrontation. It was a silence that filled the spaces around me, unbroken, undeniable, and final. The consequences arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the slow spread of frost across a window pane. Nothing dramatic, no sudden confrontation, just the inevitable, measured unfolding of what had been set in motion. The betrayer's carefully constructed control began to falter under its own weight. Subtle cracks appeared in their behavior, small hesitations that anyone paying attention could notice, and I was paying attention. Orders were questioned in the manager's office, discrepancies that could no longer be denied carefully documented by others who had begun to notice the pattern. Whispers that had once targeted me now lingered in the open, evidence of manipulation impossible to hide. The systems that had protected deception began to shift, not because of confrontation, but because truth is resilient even when quiet. The coworkers who had laughed at me, undermined me, or subtly misdirected attention faltered. Their confidence wavered in the presence of witnesses, in the presence of undeniable records, in the presence of someone who had quietly observed the whole orchestration. Their jokes lost their edge, their dismissals lost their certainty. I watched them navigate a world that had always seemed theirs to manipulate, and I saw the tension tighten like a rope around shoulders that once felt free. The mother and child, still quiet, still composed, remained present in the background. Her gaze, calm and unwavering, seemed to follow every misstep, every hesitation, every subtle falter. She said nothing, but her presence carried consequences heavier than any words could. The restaurant's rhythm shifted subtly, everyone conscious of the truth even if they could not name it. I did not celebrate. There was no sense of victory in the unraveling, no gloating, no relief. The weight of what had been done, the lies, the manipulation, the erosion of trust, still pressed against me. The consequences were real yet muted, delivered not through spectacle, but through quiet recognition, through the subtle rearrangement of power, through the undeniable exposure of reality. I continued my work, moving through the space with the same careful attention, carrying the records, the observations, and the evidence that now confirmed what had been invisible. The betrayer, aware of the shift yet powerless to reverse it entirely, adapted, but their dominance was diminished. Even the systems they had relied upon to maintain control now faltered under scrutiny. It was a slow, quiet correction, like water slowly wearing away stone. The truth did not shout. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, and that existence carried consequences impossible to ignore. By the end of the week, the restaurant had settled into a new rhythm, not the one it had before, not the one I had once trusted, but a rhythm shaped by acknowledgement. The betrayer's actions had left marks that could not be erased. Subtle, restrained, unspoken, yet undeniable. I understood then that consequences need not be loud to be effective. The damage of deception, once revealed, rippled quietly through every interaction, leaving those responsible to navigate a reality they had long tried to manipulate. And I, though weary, remained steady, holding the truth in silence. The restaurant hummed with its usual rhythm, though it no longer felt the same. The subtle tension had eased, but the air was heavier than before, weighted with recognition. The betrayer moved among the tables with a cautious precision, aware that the veil of control had slipped, yet refusing to acknowledge it. I watched them, silent, unseen in my quiet corner, carrying the truth like a careful, unspoken burden. The mother and child were there again, as always, calm, composed, unremarkable in appearance, yet commanding a presence that shifted the balance without effort. She did not intervene, did not offer comfort, did not announce her understanding. And yet, I felt it. The acknowledgement was there, subtle but complete, a quiet verification of what I had endured and what I had observed. I moved through my routine, taking orders, arranging tables, responding to customers. Each gesture was measured, deliberate, carrying the restraint I had cultivated over months of careful observation. There was no triumph in this. There was only the steady rhythm of life resuming, altered by truth, impossible to erase. The staff avoided overt confrontation. Their laughter no longer carried mockery, but it was cautious, strained, subdued. The systems that had once enabled deception were now aligned with reality, quiet but unyielding. The betrayer's power had not vanished entirely, but it had diminished, replaced by awareness, subtle consequences, and undeniable evidence. I did not speak of the betrayal. There was no need. The truth existed in the spaces between words, in the pauses, in the careful attention of those who had witnessed. The quiet justice of recognition had done what words could not, exposed the fragile structure of deceit without spectacle or drama. I left the restaurant that evening, the child's small hand slipping into his mother's as they departed. Their presence, brief and silent, had been a constant reminder that observation matters, that truth endures, and that quiet authority can reshape even the most entrenched deception. I walked home slowly, carrying nothing but my own awareness. The world had changed, not in loud confrontation, not in revenge or drama, but in the subtle, inescapable way that truth always leaves its mark. And for the first time in months, I felt the stillness settle around me, heavy, real, and final.